Okay, welcome everybody. We're glad to have you joining us today. My name is Patty Works, and I'm a former Fayette County teacher. I worked at Yates Elementary and at Cassidy. And then for the last few years, I've been working with Amplify on helping with Fayette County's amplification as we've gotten started on using the curriculum. So today what we're here to talk about is we're just going to take a look at the end of unit assessments for 4th and 5th grade for this first unit to make sure that we could answer any questions that people might have and just make sure that you knew where to locate everything. So if you would go ahead and share with us a couple of things in the chat. David added in, first of all, to please be sure to use that link in the chat box to get signed in. And then if you would just tell us your grade level, the year that you or your school started Amplify, either if you got to start live in 2019, if you started remotely in 2020, or if you're brand new to Amplify this year and you're just starting 2021. And then if you could also let us know if you have given the end of unit assessment before for these first units. If so, that would probably mean you were a 2019 person. But if you all could go ahead and let us know that information so we kind of have an idea of the group. Okay. Okay, thank you. Okay, right. Those of you, I see Danielle mentioned that they started last year, but with it being remote, the assessments weren't a focus of that. So, okay. All right, so it looks like so far most people are new to giving the assessment. Alicia Norman said, you guys gave it last week, right? At Cassidy? Okay. Thank you. That kind of helps us know our group and where we're going to be moving today. So if you will, let me just kind of explain as we get going here that our plan is to cover some of these questions about things that people often ask about the end of unit assessments, like where can you find them? Where's the assessment guide? Perhaps which version of the assessment do you want to use, version A or version B? And if you're a PGIS coach, be aware that there's in 2nd grade on this first assessment, in kindergarten, 1st and 2nd, there's not a version B, but in 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade there is. And then we'll talk a little bit about what to look for in student work and take a look at the assessment rubrics that are provided with the program. And as we're working today, be sure anytime you've got a question, jump in and ask that. If you have experience and you can share that with the group, we'd love for you to do that as well. So we're going to just start out talking about a few things that are common to both the 4th and 5th grade assessment. Then we'll sort of segue into looking at the 4th grade assessment specifically and the 5th grade assessment after that. So once we get to that point, if you're specifically interested in 5th grade, I'll give you a couple of options of what you can do as we're going through the 4th grade assessment. But please just jump in and ask questions at any time. That we want to make sure we kind of tailor this to your needs and questions. So be sure you let us know that. First of all, if you're looking to find, where can you find the assessment? On the main unit page of any of the units, there is a document that is called the assessment system. So you can open that document and it will help, you can scroll down through that and there will be a table that looks like this, that will have listed every one of the assessments that are within the program that are mostly formative, but then you can find under the assessment type, the end of unit assessment. In fourth grade, it is in lesson 4.6 this time at the very end of the unit. And that's often the way it is, but not always. So in case you're wondering, you can always find where that end of unit assessment is, looking in that assessment system document. In fifth grade, your end of unit assessment is not at the very end here in this unit. It's in lesson 3.6, activity 2. The fourth chapter involves an investigation assessment where kids are getting to investigate specific questions from your SIM and patterns of earth and sky. So your actual scientific explanation that kids write is in lesson 3.6. Now, most of the time, you just have got one particular end of unit assessment, but not always. So I've kind of highlighted here in fourth grade, you have one end of unit assessment in your first unit, energy conversions. But then once you get to the Earth's features unit, the assessment is divided into two parts that occur, one in chapter 3 and one in chapter 4. The same thing is true with fifth grade. When you get to your Earth systems unit, you have a two-part assessment there as well. Part of it's in chapter 4 and part of it in chapter 5. But just remember, anytime you're trying to find any kind of assessment, the formative assessments, the critical juncture assessments that are also formative, those are all listed in that table in the assessment system document. Okay, so at this point, we're getting ready to take a specific look at some things from the fourth grade assessment. What I want you to do, if you're a fifth grade teacher or particularly interested in that, you've got a choice of things. You can watch and see right now where your fifth grade assessment is, and because it will follow the same pattern as the fourth grade. Once you find that that lesson, you'll be able to find over in the digital resources column on the right-hand side of that lesson, the end of unit copy master that you can use, and there'll be usually a version A and a version B, as well as the assessment guide that will help you know what you're looking at. So fifth grade, if you want to go ahead and open up a tab on your computer with the platform and be taking a look at your fifth grade assessment for a minute as we're going through this, you are welcome to. Although the format of the rubrics and the ideas about using version A or version B will be the same for you as well. So you can see if you're on that lesson 4.6 in that digital resources column, you'll have a version A copy master and a version B copy master, and it will say optional. It's the same assessment. Version B is just a little more scaffolded, and we'll take a look at that, and compare the two in just a moment. Also, you're going to notice that assessment guide that we'll be looking at is in the digital resources column on that same lesson where the end of unit assessment occurs. Okay, so you see that with the fourth grade assessment, both of the versions are starting out with exactly the same prompt. In part 1, it gives the students directions about reading the question and the possible solutions to that question below. Then it asks them to also look at the criteria for the design and then think about which solution they believe will best meet that. Then they're going to be circling on this page the solution that they pick and the criteria that they think it will match. Then they'll be writing a claim that answers the question, and they'll be supporting that claim with evidence. And you also want them to be able to describe any limitations of the solution that they've chosen. So now what you're looking at is over here. This is version A. This is version B on what they're going to be answering here. So version A just gives them, and I'm going to go backwards to where they're supposed to be answering this question with an argument telling which claim they're choosing, which criteria they think it matches, and then also describing the limitations of the solution. So the directions are all here. If you give version A, this is what your students have for writing their response. If you give version B to your students, it has these sentence scaffolds to kind of remind them of particular things, that they're describing which solution they've chosen. Then they're telling which criteria it meets. They're giving a justification for why it meets that criteria. Whoops, sorry about that. And then they're giving the limitations of that solution. So if your students are new at writing design arguments, which they likely are, this version B may really give your students a lot more support. Now during the course, you have got the option of what works best for your class. And during the fall of 2019, when a lot of schools began and were giving this assessment live, most of them gave version B. And I think for this first one, that's kind of what you recommend, correct, David? You want to add in anything there?
No, you're right. That's it.
Yeah. And then we found as the year went on and kids became more comfortable with an open-ended assessment, sometimes teachers would project version B, but pass out the more open version A, because their students might want more space for something and feel constrained by where those sentence starters were added in. But for the first time that you're giving the assessment, I think most people felt like version B allowed their students to be more successful in remembering all the parts of the directions that were back on this page, because that's a lot to read and respond to. And these little scaffolds just support kids in being sure that they describe the limitations and tell which criteria it meets and why they think that solution would meet that criteria. Okay, any questions feel free to type them in the chat or unmute and ask if you have questions as we're going through here. If not,
I have a question.
Sure.
Can you hear me?
Sure.
Okay. And this might not be, I'm driving, sorry, to pick up my son from school, but if this isn't the right time to ask this question, then that's fine. But I was just wondering, so the written argument is wonderful for critical thinking and all of that, but I was wondering if there's not another assessment that does some multiple choice type thinking, or that looks a little bit like our state testing as far as what they're gonna actually see and
there are not multiple choice questions to go with these assessments. And there's a couple of reasons for that. However, I do think that you're going to find that what your kids will be doing throughout the lessons in Amplify is going to prepare them for some of those, is going to prepare them for those clusters that they'll see on the state assessment. They will be, analyzing data, they will be developing models, they will be critiquing models and those things, but there are not multiple choice questions developed.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you.
You bet. David, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
No, one of the things that fourth grade teachers may want to do, if they want to develop, 4 or 5 multiple choice questions, that's fine. If you're going to develop them, make sure you include similar questions to what they would see on the Kentucky summative, where they would have to pick 2 best answers versus just 1. Things where they're trying to determine, which is the best claim based on evidence, things along that line. Don't make them very, very low level memorization type questions, because that really doesn't prepare them very well.
Perfect, thank you.
On the part 2, after they have written their argument, then it's asking them to look at this picture, which is duplicated and given to them with the test about Ergstown's electrical system. And so they're asked to look at the picture of the town and then answer some short answer questions here. How could the problem be related to the energy source? How could the problem be related to the source converter? How could it be related to the wires? And how could it be related to the lamp? One thing I wanted to point out for you, the place that you can see possible correct answers for these questions in part 2 is on lesson 4.6, activity 1 in the possible responses tab. Would you like me to go into the platform and show you where that is, the possible responses tab? Don't you think that would that be helpful?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to escape out of here. And, okay. So when I'm in 4th grade and I go into that last lesson, 4.6. Okay, when you click into these activity tabs here, there's the one on writing the design argument, and there's a possible responses tab right here. And when you open that possible responses tab, it shows you a good answer, and that's also listed someplace else, for the best solution for improving Ergstown's electrical system and why. So they give you a sample student answer for that argument. But then here they show you in part 2, these are possible correct good answers for those short answer things that are in the part 2 of the assessment. Okay, and we'll look in just a second at the rubrics for the design argument, but I just wanted to point out to you that if you have not seen them before, that the correct answers for part 2 there are in the tab that's possible responses once you click into activity 1. Okay, and again, we looked at how that's the picture that the students have duplicated to go with their questions that they're answering there. Okay, now when we go to look at their end of unit design argument, you're going to find that is the assessment guide that we're going to be looking at in the next few slides is right there from that digital resources, list on the right-hand side of the screen. So you've got, that's where we found the version A and version B copy master. And then right below that is the assessment guide. And they're scoring their design argument based upon 4 different criterion. The first one is it responsive? Does the claim that they make answer the thing that they were asked to develop a solution for? So basically just does their claim answer the question or problem that they're trying to address? Then is it supported? Are they connecting some specific evidence to tell how that solution meets each of the design criteria? Is their writing clear and well organized? And then is it consistent with the science ideas and the data that they've been learning throughout the course of the unit? So when you look at the rubrics, because it's a 3-dimensional assessment that's highlighting all 3 parts of the next generation science standards or our Kentucky academic standards for science, you are going to see rubric 1 is particularly focusing on the science and engineering practice of constructing design arguments. Rubric 2 is looking at the disciplinary core ideas or the science ideas. And then rubric 3 is looking at the cross-cutting concept of systems and system models and whether it looks like it's obvious that they're providing evidence to you that they understand that the parts of a system work together to help the system function as a whole. So here's the first rubric where you're looking at design arguments. And we said it was looking at different things. It's looking at, is it responsive? Is it supported with evidence? And is it clear and well organized? And the way this rubric is set up, and this will be the same 5th grade for your constructing arguments, constructing explanations. Your first rubric is going to look like this too, where you either, on whether or not the argument is responsive, if they have not proposed a claim or the claim doesn't match the question or the problem that was suggested, then they would get a 0 on that part of it. You also see right here, it says possible feedback. So the reason for that is they're not assuming that students are done learning about how to write a design argument in the 4th grade. So they suggest that if you have the time and you want to, if a student has not written a claim that's in good, that you can give a point to, that this is possible feedback that you could give them and let them adjust their claim on that. So you're giving them either a 0 or 1 on whether or not it describes a solution and they tell the design criteria that it meets. Then they're getting either a 0, 1, or 2 on whether or not it is supported with evidence. So if their argument is not supported with any evidence, they'd have a 0. If it's supported with some evidence, they'd have a 1. If they've got support for all of the different design criteria that they listed, then they'd have a 2. And again, you see questions that you might ask students if you were talking with them about their writing that could help them improve their answers. And then you give them a score of someplace between 0 and 2 on whether or not it is clear and well organized. And that they don't give you specific guidelines for that because they find there's such a difference in what different teachers are considering clear and well organized that you sort of get to choose what is a 0, 1, or 2 there yourself, so you can adjust the scale kind of according to your own priorities that you've been working on in your class with writing. So you would total together, so they might have a 1 here, they could have as much as a 2 here and as much as a 2 here. So that would give them, they could have as much as a 5 on writing that design argument. On rubric 2 is looking at whether or not they are understanding the science ideas that were encountered in the unit. And so this part, rubric 2, is really looking more at the questions from part 2, okay? When they were looking at the lamp that wouldn't light up and looking at that drawing of the Ergstown electrical system. So the scoring of this is different. You're looking for specific ideas in their short answers. Do they show an understanding that energy is the ability to make something move or change and that there are different forms of energy? If they do, then you can give them a point here. If they don't, you just give them a 0. Does the student show understanding of the conversions and transfers of energy that happen and that talk about energy flowing through the system, and they either get a point or they don't get a point? And then the same thing down here. Does the student show an understanding that energy is being conserved in the system? Then they give you examples of what that might look like. Okay, like if their writing says that the lamp needs energy to light up, and that's why it's not lighting up, that could be considered evidence that they understand that energy is needed to make something, to make the lamp light up, to make something move or change. So these are just samples of what will qualify as evidence that you could give them a 1 here, okay? But these pretty much, that rubric 2 comes from those short answer questions that were in part 2 of your assessment. And then rubric 3 is looking at their understanding of systems and system models. So if in their writing, either in the first design argument or within those short answer questions, they show an understanding of the fact that the parts of an electrical system have to work together for the whole system to work and for them to have electricity, then they get 1 point. And if they show an understanding that if any part of the system is not working, the lamp from part 2 won't be able to output energy, then they get a point. So they have a possible 2 points if they show understanding of systems and system models here. Okay. And I think sometimes it's easier to look at an example where you can see that. And I think it's really helpful to look at some of these possible student responses even before you get to that point in the unit, to kind of know what sort of writing you're looking for your students, what you're looking for in your students' writing. So there's going to be different possible responses, and they are in that assessment guide after those 3 rubrics. So that's where you find the possible answers for the design criteria. And the same thing in 5th grade for your explanation. After the 3 rubrics for the assessment, that's where you'll find some sample possible responses. So first it shows you here, for example, this is a response that meets all the criteria. It's clear and well organized. It's causal and explanatory, and they're addressing the different criteria as well as mentioning limitations. So you can see through this, they start out and tell the best solution. So it's meeting the criteria of making a claim that goes back and answers the problem they were trying to use. And then they're telling which design criteria they use, because it converts more energy than other solutions. They aren't too expensive and they're reliable. And then it shows you examples of how they know that. From using the sim, they found out that the wind turbine was more efficient. They know that it's not too expensive because they read about that in It's All Energy. They know they're reliable because they've learned during the course of the unit that it's windy in Ergstown and they're going to have plenty of wind as the energy source that can be converted by those turbines. Okay, then it gives you an example of a response that is responsive to the question. It suggests what they might do, building more wind turbines, but then it doesn't really support it with how they know that. So it doesn't go back and say, we learned particularly in the sim that this was more efficient, or we learned it's plenty windy in Ergstown, so a wind turbine would be a good solution. So that's the example that's given of the design argument that meets all of the different criteria that would score a total of 5 points on that assessment rubric. Okay. All right, so that's sort of the end of going through specific elements of the post-assessment for 4th grade. 4th grade, folks, questions that you have at this point. Yes, we'll take a look at the 5th grade possible answers to the possible student responses in both cases, 4th and 5th grade, are going to be after the 3 rubrics there. And we'll look through the 5th grade 1, 2, and I'll show you where there's some, like for instance, there is one possible responses tab for 5th grade on the platform that also shows which constellations they might have drawn. So we'll look at that in just a second. But always these possible student responses are after the rubrics in the assessment guide. Okay, any other questions before we start looking at 5th grade? Or anyone that's administered this that wants to add anything from their experience?
Patty, there's a question in the chat. Are they allowed to use any of the resources they used on the unit during the test? Do we leave the key concepts up, et cetera?
Yes, I'd leave those key concepts up. David, how do you feel about them using their resources?
Honestly, at this point, by all means, allow them. I mean,
Yes.
we've got to support the kids the best we can. We know that last year's tough. And that's why we're encouraging the B versions, especially initially. So yeah, I have no problems. I certainly don't want to get into sanitizing rooms and things like that for an end of unit assessment. You wouldn't do that typically. So right. Business as usual.
You know, and during the first year of implementation with Amplify, I know David's response was always, be a good teacher, you know, do what you think is going to help your students be successful on this exam. And if they remember, for instance, that they read something about turbines in It's All Energy, but they don't remember something about that, I would by all means let them go back and read to find that information and add it into their writing, because what you're wanting to teach them is how to find information that helps answer questions and how to develop writing that is responsive to the claim and providing plenty of evidence. And so I would much rather, if it were me, have them go back and find those particular things so they had strong evidence to support their claim, because I think that's really the big takeaway from this, in my opinion. So
I have a question, Patty.
Uh-huh.
Or anyone who's given it. I was just curious if anyone had tried doing more of like a performance task with the unit assessment versus just a written response. Is this what the district needs to see, though, is the writing, or can we kind of manipulate it into something else?
David, I'm going to let you answer district questions.
Say it again. Danielle.
I was just curious if we could manipulate it into more of like a performance-based task, or if it needs to be a written response.
Well, I mean, yes and no. How's that for a good answer for you? I have no problem with it being a performance-based type approach, but we also need to keep in mind, because we did have the kids out for a year last year and they did not get exposure at the same level they traditionally would, the more that we can do to build up their stamina and to get them back into the swing of things, the better off it'll be for them. So yeah, I see where you're coming from. It's a great, option, but, keeping in mind what's best for the kids and where we need to get them. And I'm sure you guys have seen the stamina that they have right now compared to a typical year. It is pretty different.
And I'm just thinking about this particular unit too. I mean, there are certain things that they've done along the way as far as designing and redesigning their wind turbine that they were making, that there were some embedded performance tasks that along the way with what they were doing, really, when they were creating their solar panel circuits and sharing those. I certainly think there'd be nothing at all wrong with adding some performance test kinds of things to this. I do think it's good to give them the experience with writing the design argument as well. Is that helpful? Okay. Other questions, anybody?
So if this is a common assessment, doesn't the district kind of want to see the same thing from all of us?
Well, as long as the rubric would be the same and the expectations would be the same, Yeah, it's going to be similar. But I also keep in mind that because these are being given in very, very different environments from school to school, that the use of the rubric does tend to lead to validation issues. So it really is much more for the students and for the teachers than for the district. You know, that's one thing that you want to keep, and that's one reason that with this assessment, we want just a regular end of unit assessment. We didn't want to do anything special or anything different. We just wanted teachers to do what teachers are going to be doing anyway. So that's the importance as far as my perspective comes from. It's not a watchdog kind of thing by any stretch of the imagination.
David, I see
Yes.
that Emily Sharp has added in a question that she says, I thought that they weren't going to be taken as a common assessment anymore.
Okay, what that boils down to is what is a common assessment and what is an end of unit assessment. In science, they are one of the same. Okay, there is no difference. Every single Amplify assessment in every classroom is the same. I mean, we're all using the same curriculum platform. What's different this year is Friday afternoon, an email was sent out by Sharonda Morton that said that we will not be collecting the data at the district level. So that's where you get into, oh, it's not a common assessment. If you define a common assessment as something where you submit data, that's true. But the end of unit assessments, the formative assessments, absolutely, we still want teachers to be using the data in their PLCs.
That's why I had said, like, I thought if you wanted to add some sort of performance assessment options to the assessment yourself, you could, but you'd still want to give these so that down the road someday, if you are turning in assessment scores, which we did the fall of 2019, schools turned in the scores on the rubrics, on rubric 1, 2, and 3 to the district. So, but again, David at the time had selected the end of unit assessment. So it wasn't a stop, drop, and do a common assessment kind of thing, but it was just a part of your regular teaching, that the assessment that was already embedded within the program was what was used as the district's common assessment.
So let me ask this then, David, I'll direct it to you based on what
Okay.
you said, Sharonda said about not looking at the data. Are we still going to be filling out that Excel sheet that you sent out?
That would be your call.
Okay,
If
that
you-
won't be a district requirement, but that's what you're saying would probably be beneficial for like PLCs and stuff.
PLC, sure. It's a great way to look at the data as a whole and to do trend analysis and so on. The difference is that will not be sent to me. So, but for teachers to use it for PLCs, yeah, that's a handy little tool. And if you want to use it for the rest of the assessments, we can sure modify it for you. That's not a problem either.
Okay, is it okay if I go ahead into the 5th grade material just to go through those examples? Because I know we've got some folks that are wanting to see that especially. And then we can take some more questions at the end, but you'll see there are a lot of patterns to this. 5th grade folks. Again, you're going to have a version A and a version B that you can choose to use. Down here, here's our version A, where they're explaining the artifact, and then version B. And so you can choose which of those you want to use. Part 1 is the same in both versions. And I want to point out that when you look through the Google Slides or whatever, or PowerPoint, whichever ones you use, it's directing students, first of all, to use page 59 from their student investigation notebook to help them with writing their answer for this part. So they've used page 59 in their student investigation notebook, and they have used those constellation posters that are up around the wall to be able to identify. They know by this point that this is spring, that it was probably about March during this piece because they've identified these constellations and these seasons. And so if page 59 in their student investigation notebook asks them to look at the posters that are up around their room of the constellations and look and see what's represented in A, B, and C. And then there is a possible responses tab there in lesson 3.6, activity 1, that lists different things they could have as possible correct answers here. And so again, I'm just going to go into the platform there and show that's in 5th grade. Sorry, I'm trying to get rid of my goofy bar here. Okay, so I'm going back to 5th grade. And in Patterns of Earth and Sky, your assessment is in chapter 3, lesson 3.6. And so again, you see down here, there's the version A and version B, and here's the assessment guide that has the rubrics and the possible responses. But when you come up here to the teacher-led discussion about what is the missing constellation there, you see a possible responses tab again too, which shows you based on what the kids have done in previous lessons and made these constellation posters that are hung around. They could choose to draw any one of these different March constellations as being the one that's on that missing piece. So just don't forget about that possible responses tab, because sometimes there are some answers for parts of assessments there as well too. If you've gone through and taught those units and used the slides, you'll probably recognize that, but I was just pointing it out in case. Somebody have a question?
Because they're separate parts, it would be a lot better.
No, it was just some kind of mic on, Patty.
Okay, somebody's, all right. I clicked wrong thing here. Okay, so here's the difference then. When you, so part 1 is exactly the same between version A and version B. Students are using what they've learned, using those posters around the room, choosing a spring constellation to add in to that missing spot. Then this is version A on the left, where they're answering the same question, just version B has these sentence scaffolds to support them. So you're asking, why does the sky look different in each of those nighttime sections of the artifact? And then here, it just supports them in saying the sky looks different because different constellations are visible on different nights throughout the year because, and this means that, to get them to start to talk about some of those different patterns that they have learned about in the way that the Earth is moving. On part 3 and part 4, version A and B look exactly the same. So the only thing that you're going to see as a difference there are just the sentence scaffolds on part 2. And so part 3 asks, why does the nighttime section of the artifact show other stars in the sky? Why does the daytime section show only the sun in the sky, but not other stars? And why does the pattern of daytime and nighttime repeat every day? So students are just writing short answers in on part 3. On part 4, you're getting to that standard about down being towards the center of the Earth. And so students are going to draw an arrow next to each person to show which way is up for them, and then answer the question about why does this person not fall off the Earth over here. So they've got short answer sections, and here they're drawing arrows. When you get to the assessment guide there, let's take a look at what's in it. Same thing that that's very similar to what we saw in 4th grade, that same pattern, they're writing an end of unit explanation about the missing piece of the artifact instead of an argument. But you're going to have 3 core criteria for explanations. Does the explanation answer the question? And does it describe how or why something happens as it does, not just stating something that's observable? Is it clear and well organized? And then is it grounded in evidence? Although they don't have to specifically reference certain things in their explanation, the evidence that they're providing should be consistent with what they have learned about movements of the earth and the way that light from the sun and the stars is visible. So it's a 3-dimensional assessment. And so there are 3 rubrics. This 5th grade one is looking at constructing explanations. You're looking at the disciplinary core ideas, the science ideas, and giving points for things that they have observed there. And then patterns is your cross-cutting concept. So as you look here at the rubric 1, that's assessing the science and engineering practice of constructing explanations, is it causal or explanatory? Okay, so does the explanation go beyond or add to just simple observations to really help explain something about why different constellations are visible in different parts of the artifact? So again, they get a 0 on that part if they did not explain why, and they get a 1 if their writing goes beyond just describing what's observable to share either that at a given time we see some constellations but not others, or why the constellations we see would change over time. And again, there's possible feedback questions. And then they would get a 2 if they explain both of those things. Why at a given time we see some constellations but not others, and why the ones that we see change over time because of the way the Earth is orbiting the sun. So they get any place between they get any place between a 0 or a 1 on causal and explanatory, a 0, 1, or 2, on causal or explanatory. And then they get any place between a 0 and a 2 on whether or not their writing is written so that it's easily understandable to their audience. In rubric 2, they're going to be getting 1 point for each science idea that is included in their answers on the assessment. And the answers on part 3 and part 4 of the assessment are what you'll use to help score this, okay? So just to flip back to remind you what part 3 and part 4 were. Okay, there's part 3 where they're answering the questions, why does the nighttime section of the artifact show other stars in the sky but not the sun? Why does the daytime section only show the sun? Why does the pattern of daytime and nighttime repeat? And then what's up, what's down, and gravity pulling things towards the center of the Earth. So the information that they have used in their answers on parts 3 and 4 will be where you'll find whether or not you can give them a point for each of these things. And again, it will give you an example of evidence and what that evidence might include, that if they describe that the different panels show different times of the year, and that, or if they describe that the Earth orbits the sun once each year, and that when Earth is in a different place as it moves around the sun, you're seeing different constellations. If they have something like that, then they get a 1, okay? And the same thing here. So they've got a total of 4 points that they could have on rubric 2. And then rubric 3 is how well they're understanding the idea of patterns. And so does their explanation describe that the change in constellations on the panels is the result of a pattern that happens as Earth orbits the sun? If so, they get 1 point. Does it explain that the daily pattern of night and day results because Earth is spinning once a day? Then they get a point there. So on rubric 3 about patterns, they can have a possible 2 points. Okay, and then again, you can see what a strong answer looks like in the possible responses that are given after the 3 rubrics in the assessment guide that was on that right-hand column. So here you see that the possible, at the top, you've got an example of an explanation that meets all those criteria. And you notice it's only like 3 or 4 sentences long. They're just really well-constructed sentences. And if you've got that unit wall up with the key concepts that you have added to it, and kids are used to referring to those key concepts as they're writing, I think that will really be helpful. Then here, this gives you an example of an explanation that is causal and explanatory, but it's not really grounded in evidence that they've learned during the course of the unit. And then the bottom one shows you, why does the sky look different in each nighttime section? This is grounded. They say, yes, Earth orbits the sun, but they don't tell what that causes to happen or explain how that orbit affects the constellations that are seen in the different parts of the artifact. So that's where your examples are, is at the end of those 3 rubrics. Okay, now let us know what questions you've got, guys. I see that Heidi has asked David in the, because we have deadlines for assessments, do the schools need to let you know when their assessments are complete?
No, we just try to stay as close to the pacing guide as we can. That will be the driving map per se. And then the chiefs will work with building administrators and so on as far as monitoring pacing guides and whatnot.
Okay, questions, you guys? Other questions that you have? We want you to let us know how we can help you in any way.
The only other thing I'd add in there then is, I remember if you guys want Patty or I to come out and meet with your PLCs and work with your schools, feel free to shoot us an email and we'll see what we can schedule for you. I know we've been very, very busy, which is a great thing. Certainly appreciate it. And if you've not signed in, please make sure you're signed in and we'll be good to go.
And I'm happy to hang around if any of you want to ask any questions after the group has kind of left. You sure can.